Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. I am super excited for today's video because I have a confession to make about some eyeshadow palettes that I used to love, and I just need to be honest with myself and to you guys and to let you know that I just am not loving these 10 eyeshadow palettes like I used to. Some of these used to be absolute favorites in my collection, but one really awesome thing that I did for myself even this year was to do the No Pan Left Behind project, and it really allowed me to get to know my eyeshadow palettes in a way that I haven't before. So frequently in the past, I would have like 7 eyeshadow palettes open at a time, and I would reach into each palette for like one shade at a time. So I feel like I wasn't ever really putting like just a singular eyeshadow palette to the test. Yes, sometimes I would do a look with just like the palette, but really focusing on No Pan Left Behind has made me think of my eyeshadow palette collection in a different way, and I've had so much fun doing it. I already cannot wait to do the same thing next year. But through doing this, I found that one, I'm bored with some of the older palettes in my collection. Like, I was so excited about them when they released a few years ago, but now they've been sitting in my collection for quite some time. I feel like I've been testing a lot more indie shadows, and I'm just so much more excited about some of the newer formulas that are being released and that I've tried, that some of these palettes just do not feel as special as they once did. Some of them you may see me declutter at the end of the year. And many of these palettes I really truly did love at one point or another, but you know, our tastes and our preferences are allowed to change, and I'm allowed to just like get bored of something, especially after it's been in my collection for a few years. So I have 10 eyeshadow palettes to share with you guys today that I just don't love as much as I used to. If you're interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love for you to consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, you guys, I am preparing for a very, very fun trip, but I do have color guard on. I probably could wash it off at this point, but I'm trying to like really let the tan set in. I plan to do another layer a couple days from now. So just ignore it. I literally have like color guard like on my shirt, but that's okay. That's okay. Okay, you guys, I think I might start with the most shocking of them all, and it like really pains me to say that I just don't love this palette like I used to, but I actually think I may end up decluttering this one. And this used to be like my favorite palette in my collection. It's the Nabla Side by Side palette, and using this palette, No Pan Left Behind style, I realized that I just don't love the quality in this palette like I used to. It could be that this was really, in my opinion, good quality at the time that I brought this into my collection, but now I've just tried so many more eyeshadow palettes, so many more formulas, and I just don't think this eyeshadow formula is anything to write home about anymore. It also could be that this palette is quite old in my collection at this point in time, and over time like the formula has just diminished. But I just like, I look at this and I'm like, I just do not get excited about using this palette anymore. I look at this palette and I feel a bit bored. I do think my mom or my sister might really, really like this palette, so I will likely end up passing it along to one of them. But this is the palette that kind of like sparked the idea for this video, because like I said, this was like literally my favorite palette, I believe in, did this come out in 2019 or 2020? I can't remember, but it was my favorite palette at the time. It replaced my Soft Glam, which I loved, and I couldn't shut up about this palette. But now I'm just like, it just doesn't excite me at all. The way I feel about this palette is like when you've been chasing that guy for like so long, and then like he finally gives you the attention that you're looking for, and then it's just like you're over it. You're over it. You're bored. No thank you. Who's been there? Who's been there? The second palette that this, oh yeah, there's, okay, these next two. No, I'm gonna save the other two for the end that are like really like, they pain me. This one, I was reaching for this, I think it was yesterday. Yes, yesterday I filmed my Q&A, and I pulled out my Colourpop Stone Cold Fox because this is currently, I'm doing a chopping block series on my channel right now, and the current like grouping of palettes on the chopping block are all of my like cool toned eyeshadow palettes for the cold weather. I feel like I actually, as I've been going through my collection, I'm like, oh, I missed a couple that I could have included in this grouping. Anyway, I pulled this out because I'm trying to decide whether or not I want to keep this in my collection. And this is one of the palettes that like I really don't know, or really wasn't certain if I was going to keep in my collection. So yesterday I did a look using, well, I reached into this palette for the mattes. And then I did a shade from the Glaminatrix Fairy Lights palette all over the lid. And I just was so unimpressed with the matte shadows in this palette. And I used to really enjoy this palette as well. I don't feel like I've gotten a ton of use out of this palette throughout its lifetime, but I used to have much more of an appreciation for this palette because I was like, oh, well, I have every cool toned eyeshadow I could need. But this, as well as the Colourpop That's Taupe palette, I just feel like the shadows are extremely dusty and have a ton of kick up and kind of blend away into nothing. I was really trying to build up my look yesterday and like mix these two shades together, and I was really getting nowhere in terms of blending my eyeshadow, and I was also getting just so much kick up, so much dustiness. So I'm going to continue to try and like work my way through the rows and see if maybe it's just those mattes in that like pinky sort of shades. I do think I will end up keeping the majority of the like metallic or shimmer shades and depot them, but I'm not sure this one is going to make it through the declutter either. And this again is a palette that I used to love having in my collection, but I've never really liked something this big. Plus, I mean, cool tone palettes are like the trendy thing right now, so I feel like I just have other cool tone palettes I'm so much more excited about, and I feel like have better quality in this. Both palettes with like dusty pinks or mauves, as well as palettes with cool toned shades similar to the others throughout this palette. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all. And it's like, it's 8:20 in the morning. My mind should be awake, right? This palette I really did love last year. And I think the reason I'm not as excited about this palette anymore is because I've been trying so many indie eyeshadow brands and their shades are just so much more special. But the Sigma Enchanted palette, I will be the first one to say, I don't think Sigma has an incredible eyeshadow formula. I just do not think, like, their matte formula is not good in my opinion. I feel like it's patchy, it's not easy to blend. And I just completely disagree with people who say like Sigma has this incredible formula. But I do really enjoy, and I really loved reaching into the Sigma Enchanted palette this year. I really liked the shade Metamorphosis. I also really liked Plume, Budding, and Cosmos. But they're all shades that now I definitely have in indie shadows that are more punchy, more metallic, more up my alley. The shade Metamorphosis, I'm thinking of the blue-brown, just super intense special shade out of the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette. I'm definitely not keeping this palette around for the matte shades, so this is another one I also think you'll see decluttered. But I loved this palette last year. I reached for this palette so much last year, but now that I have expanded my indie shadow collection, I just really don't feel like I have a need for that, and it's not one I'm like, ooh, let me reach for the Sigma Enchanted. Oh, I forgot there's a third palette that I think you guys will be shocked by one of the palettes I'm going to talk about. Okay, Colourpop Going Coconuts. There's a time and a place for this palette, and I won't say this palette ever was like, oh my gosh, I'm like the most excited to reach for this. But even more so now, I'm just like, I just look at this and I'm like bored, which I get. Like, this palette really serves a purpose of just being like the most perfect neutral palette, but like, I don't know, I just like look at this and I feel extremely bored. I would rather reach for my Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette, and I likely have these shades in there. I don't think I will end up decluttering this, just because I do feel like there's like a very perfect time and place for this palette. But I used to really love this palette and really hold this palette on a pedestal, and now I'm just like, When this palette first launched, I was so into this palette. I reached for this palette just about every single day. I had a very specific look that I did. I did this shade right here in the crease, this all over the lid, this on the inner corner. It was my go-to freaking look, and I absolutely loved it. But I have not, I think maybe I burned myself out doing that, and I just like have not been excited about this palette really since. I don't know if this is a palette that I could potentially depot. If I could, I would literally just depot these three shades and get rid of the rest. I just don't care as much about the rest of the shades. And I think maybe I held this palette on such a pedestal because it really was like my go-to comfort look. Every single day I was doing that look. But I'm like, do I really love the palette so much as a whole? I do actually really like this shade too if I want something a little bit deeper. But this is, I never wake up in the morning and I'm like, ooh, I really want to reach for the Lawless the Baby one, when that used to be the case. Was that 2020 that launched? That was one of my favorite palettes of 2020. The Dominique Cosmetics Latte palette. I feel like this is always on the chopping block and then I can never get myself to declutter it because it really is such a solid palette, especially for like if you're looking for good warm tone mattes. I mean, they're just right across the top row here. The shimmers here are also extremely metallic, but they're very, very smooth on the eye. They remind me of the Persona Identity 1 palette. I don't know what it is about this palette that just like does not get me, that doesn't make me think of this palette, doesn't make me want to reach into this palette. I don't think I'll end up decluttering this palette, but I really did love this palette when it first came into my collection. Maybe I just really bought into the hype of this palette. This was very, very popular, very raved about when this first came out. So maybe that's just died down. I should do something with the shade Macchiato because I've been itching to do like a cool toned look with like a satin taupe shimmery shade all over the eye, and I feel like this would be really, really beautiful for that, but I just have not felt motivated, inspired, or excited to reach for this palette in a couple of years. My Natasha Denona Lila palette. This was my first ever Natasha palette, so this was a big deal for me to purchase. It was very expensive, and I feel like for that reason, I definitely held this palette really near and dear to my heart. I've also created some looks that I've really, really loved and enjoyed. And actually, now that I think about it, now that like cool tones are coming back, maybe I will reach for this more. I actually think I would get more use out of the shades that I like in this palette if I were to like take these out and just put it in a magnetic palette. I look into this palette and I'm like, ooh, I don't feel like I can create like a full look that I'm excited about with this palette. But in reality, I mean, I really do love like this entire L of shadows. And I also really enjoy like this shade and this shade right here. I think I just get thrown off by like the deeper purple and the pink because they're just not shades that I'm going to reach for that frequently. And then these are like not my favorite shades over off to the side either. And it is like definitely a darker palette overall. There's not like a lot of light shades really going on. So I do feel like I have to dip into another palette to create a look that I personally like with this palette. This is not something I'm going to be getting rid of, but this used to like hold such a special place in my heart. You can tell I've gotten, especially like these bottom rows. Natasha Denona has deep shades and these are like the large pans. You can tell I've gotten love and use out of this palette, but I just have not felt the same excitement as I once did to reach into this. But maybe I should set this aside and really create a look with this quite soon. And then the final three palettes. This one I don't know if it's gonna be like super shocking. I don't feel like I've talked about this palette like a ton on my channel, but the Colourpop Making Mauves palette I really did like at one point in time. I used to be super into mauves and I recently reached for this again because I'm trying to kind of go through all the full tone palettes in my collection because they're all on the chopping block, and I was really just so uninspired by the look that I created with this palette. I was like, ugh, what am I really keeping this around for? I again could see myself for sure depotting like these three shades and keeping those around, and then potentially keeping like tongue-tied, Big Fig, and that's probably it. And I don't even know that I would keep these two. I just have other like dusty mauves that work so much better in my collection. There is something about cool tone shades for Colourpop sometimes that I just feel like are too dusty and kind of blend away into nothingness. But I do really like these three shades, so I would keep these three around. But I used to love this palette so much and I'm just so unimpressed now that no thank you. Again, kind of going through all of my cool tone palettes, I was so in love with the Lunar Beauty Eternal Eclipse palette. I pulled this out. Is that mold? No, that's just a black shade. I pulled this out to start testing it and I just was like, I just don't really care to do anything with this. But yet, now that I'm looking into it, I'm like, but I can't. There's no way I could declutter this. But I keep telling myself I'm going to. Maybe I need to like set this out again and try and use it. I think my thing with this is I look at this and I've got these neutral shades throughout other palettes, even though they are really beautiful. And like these shades on top are pretty, but like I just purchased the Cleota Cosmetics Sunken Treasure like grouping of 9 pans, which are just so much more special than the shades in here. It's hard for me to get excited to reach into this. There's so many like Odin's Eye palettes that I would rather reach for over this, that I'm like really struggling to decide whether or not I want to keep this. I had, before turning the camera on, I was like, I'm definitely decluttering this, but now looking at it, I'm like, I'm gonna set that aside, try and create like 1 or 2 more looks, and we'll see what happens. And then the 10th and final palette, you guys, I think will shock you. And this is not something I'm going to declutter, but I just am not as excited about the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette as I once was. And I think the reason being is when I purchased this, I did not have a lot of colorful eyeshadow in my collection. And this really was like a comfort colorful palette to me, because there were still like neutral shades in here, but I could do like a pop of blue, a pop of purple, etc. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still shades in here that I absolutely love. I love the shade Galaxy, Supernova, Gold Glitch. Even Frazzled, which is like this gold green sort of shade. I still really enjoy this palette. I always joked, so I didn't know what Mercury Retrograde was actually until I think maybe this palette came out. And leading up to that, I am someone who's always said like I thrive in chaos. I love to be in chaos. Things have definitely changed. I don't love chaos anymore. But then this palette was releasing, I loved Huda Beauty, and I was like, what's Mercury Retrograde? And I looked it up and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like the mascot of my life. Like I live in constant Mercury Retrograde, it feels like. So there's like a nostalgic feeling that I have with this palette for that reason. I don't think I would ever declutter it, which is so weird that like I just have such a nostalgic feeling to this palette because it's named the Mercury Retrograde, where I feel like there's other palettes where like I have worn them to like special events that you would think would be so much more nostalgic, but like this is, I feel like, my most nostalgic palette in my collection. But again, I just like, I also think like I look at this color story and I'm like, I would have done, like, the mattes are just not my favorite mattes. I just am like, well, what do I really do with this? So for that reason, I just don't find myself reaching into this one that frequently. Now, I will say, I'm planning to do pan those palettes next year. Pan that palette didn't work for me, but I'm planning to choose 4 eyeshadow palettes to kind of cycle through and just try and hit pan in every pan in the 4 palettes. And this is what I'm thinking about, although I will say I don't think I'll hit pan on every matte shade, but I definitely am thinking about this palette for pan those palettes because I think it would be really fun. Plus I feel like I'm kind of close to pan on Nebula. I think I could hit pan pretty quickly on Cosmic as well as Supernova. And then like I do really love Gold Glitch, and I feel like I've used it more than like the pan shows. I just feel like the texture of the shadow kind of like, it's more of like a creamy, like cream to more just like a creamy, I don't want to say sticky sort of shade. Oh, I forget just how beautiful that shade is. Okay, I'm pulling this palette out to reach for it too. And this is one I think I will potentially include in my pan those palettes next year. Try and hit pan on as many shades as possible. I will likely declutter the palettes that I include in that at the end of 2024, but if I include this, I don't know that I would declutter it. Anyway, I'm not as excited about this palette as I once was. And that is the 10th and final palette that I no longer feel as much love in my heart. That was so cheesy, but I no longer love them like I used to. I would love to know if you have any palettes in your collection that kind of fit into this category. I think part of it too, like as I mentioned at the beginning, is some of these palettes have been in my collection since like 2018, 2019, and we just get, like, at least me, I just get bored of my things over time. Like I just get bored of my things. I'm thinking of like my favorite clothes even. Like it's like, okay, after a couple years, it's like, I'm kind of bored of this. Except for like, there's one very specific shirt in my collection that like was my go-to go-out shirt. And I may need to like drop a couple pounds before I could fit back into that shirt, but that would still be my favorite shirt of all time. And I'm pretty sure I've owned that for over 10 years. And by shirt, I mean like dressy tank. Anyway, totally unrelated. That is gonna wrap it up for today's video. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch. Let me know in the comments what palettes you're bored of, and I'll catch you guys in tomorrow's video. I love you so much. Bye.